I'd just like to provide a broader context to our discussion tonight and then give some specific suggestions from my organization as to what the New York legislature can do to prevent the takings we've been discussing tonight. My name is Christina Walsh, and I'm the Director of Activism and Coalitions at the Institute for Justice. IJ is the nation's leading critic of and legal advocate against the abuse of eminent domain. We represented Suzette Kelo and her neighbors before the U.S. Supreme Court, as well as many others across the country, and we worked with thousands of property owners, activists, and legislators across New York and the country. Eminent domain is the power to seize and destroy long-time homes, to destroy a hard-working entrepreneur's dream for the sake of someone with more money and powerful friends. It's a power that's been disproportionately wielded against minority populations and communities that are less well off to seize what they've worked so hard to own, simply to give it to someone with more political clout. Across the nation, as we've heard previous speakers discuss, legislatures have rejected Kelo, which declared that perfectly fine homes and businesses can be seized purely for private development. We've seen 43 states change their eminent domain laws, and still New York has done nothing. And as a recent report that we've released, Building Empires, Destroying Homes, Eminent Domain Abuse in New York, New York is by far the worst abuser of eminent domain in the country. While legislatures nationwide turn their attention to reform, state high courts have similarly sided with property owners. Not a single state high court has relied on Kelo in interpreting their own state constitutions. Indeed, 8 different state high courts have ruled in favor of property owners when considering public use assertions. Unfortunately, the Court of Appeals in New York continues to buck the trend and do nothing to thwart this abuse of power. Instead of thoughtfully reviewing eminent domain determinations, the court, except in the case of Columbia, has habitually rubber-stamped condemnations, uncritically accepting any local government determination of blight and public purpose, as was demonstrated in the Atlantic Yards case. Now, where the Court of Appeals failed, as we've discussed today, the first department of the Appellate Division gave New Yorkers hope, but the ESCC will undoubtedly appeal this decision to the Court of Appeals. And unfortunately, given that court's deference to local determinations of blight and public purpose, no matter how bereft of fact or evidence, and its blind eye to pretext, New Yorkers have lost hope that the highest protectors of the law in their state will fulfill their sworn duty to uphold the Constitution. The level of abuse occurring in New York comes as no surprise in a state where the eminent domain process is nearly impossible to navigate, even for attorneys. The time for legislative reform is now. The future of property rights in New York cannot be left in the hands of judges who refuse to meaningfully review the exercise of the despotic power. There are many ways the legislature can ensure that New York is a place where development thrives and property rights are respected. There must be a change in judicial review of eminent domain decisions. As shown by the Court of Appeals, New York courts believe they're obliged to defer to the government, meaning they accept whatever the government says, no matter how ridiculous it is. Although the Columbia decision is a promising sign, it's just one appellate court, and the overall attitude of New York courts has been generally terrible, only get worse now. The statute should be changed to explicitly put the burden of proof on the government or abolish such judicial deference, as other states have done. Fortunately, the Court of Appeals stopped just short of adopting Kelo in the Atlantic Yards case, but the legislature itself should say that economic development is not a public use. In New York, most condemnations occur by labeling an area blighted or a redevelopment area, which allows any property within that area to be condemned. These designations currently do not expire, and there's no requirement that a new study be done when creating redevelopment plans. We saw one municipality use data from a 1960s study to condemn property in 2000 and 2001. State law can and should hold that redevelopment areas expire and that a study must be conducted to create or renew a redevelopment designation. Right now, New York doesn't require the majority of property in a redevelopment area or urban renewal area be found blighted before the area can be designated as such. Such a requirement would prevent what was talked about at oral argument in the Atlantic Yards case, designating huge areas blighted based on just a few bad properties. New York also lacks any objective criteria for blight designations. The current definitions are so vague that literally any property can be considered blighted. It's essential that New York tighten its statutory definition to include only those properties that pose an immediate threat to public health and safety. We've seen other states tighten their definitions in such a way, and it significantly decreased the amount of eminent domain abuse we saw for blight, so-called blight remediation. The objective criteria should state specifically that underutilization, plainly put, that an area could be put to a more profitable use, exactly like any property in New York or in the country, because anything can make more money as something bigger and newer. That this can't be a basis for a blight determination, as was the justification in Atlantic Yards. And finally, pretextual condemnations should be prohibited by statute. In addition to these substantive improvements, there are a number of procedural ones that I outlined in the written testimony I've submitted to your committee. Clearly, there's much room for improvement in New York's law. 16 skyscrapers and a basketball arena are not public uses. A wealthy elite university's expansion is not a public use. A pretextual denial of services for decades in order to prepare property for condemnation for private development, as we see going on in Willets Point today, is an abomination of the law and an abuse of eminent domain. Eminent domain is not the answer to your state's financial woes. Throwing millions upon millions of dollars at these projects for which there's no market and no sound financial backing does not guarantee their success. IJ has documented dozens of large-scale projects that relied on the use of eminent domain and failed, leaving nothing but enormous debt, unfulfilled promises, and destroyed communities in their wake. We need not look far for a prime example of what may come of these grand schemes. In The Truth About Times Square, a recent study that IJ published, William Stern, who was the chairman and CEO of the Urban Development Corporation under Mario Cuomo, and who personally oversaw the redevelopment of Times Square, explains how eminent domain actually retarded development of 42nd Street. At the time, Stern believed that eminent domain was necessary and vital to rebuilding Times Square from what it was and what it had become by the early 1980s. But as he came to experience and looking back now, he regrets that approach, and he sees that eminent domain put Times Square on a steadily rapid decline towards despair and disrepair. And he demonstrates how the promises of economic development that we hear accompany these threats of eminent domain abuse today are ill-founded. Further restrictions on the ability to condemn private property have no negative impacts on economic growth, as we demonstrated in our study on economic trends and post-Kelo eminent domain reform. And not using eminent domain actually encourages private development. And all these resources are included with the testimony I submitted. Nowhere else in the country is eminent domain used to benefit private interests so rampantly and brazenly. And Building Empires, Destroying Homes, which I've included in my packet, explores the details of 22 projects that have threatened or used eminent domain for private development. And this is merely skimming the top of eminent domain abuse in New York. The property rights of all New Yorkers can no longer be left up to a judicial body that refuses to enforce constitutional limitations on the use of eminent domain and defers to any finding of any government body. Eminent domain reform in the Empire State is long overdue, and more property owners will receive condemnation notices the longer this legislature waits to pass reform. And I wanted to thank you very much for your efforts on this issue, Senator Perkins. You've been a tremendous ally, and we look forward to helping you in any way that we possibly can at IJ.
Well, thank you so much for what you've been doing, and we're going to be using your support as much as possible, because this is a humongous task in front of us, but I think we can make a big difference.